So good afternoon. My name is Rachel Kyte. I'm the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University in Massachusetts, and it's my pleasure to be able to frame and engage with a wonderful panel on the nexus of the crises of climate and debt and the threat that poses to security. So there's been considerable focus here the last few days on the situation in Ukraine. This session will take us to look globally at the worldwide cost of living crisis it has in part provoked. Inflation, fuel and food price hikes are driving a debt crisis around the world, and this is happening at the same time as climate impacts are pummeling countries in every region of the world. The rising severity of these impacts is, of course, in particular felt by the vulnerable within countries, and, of course, vulnerable countries themselves are among those who have had little to do with the causes of climate change and the causes of this crisis. If we calculate how many countries are losing large percentage points of GDP every year from the climate crisis, then it starts to really add up, and it's not just developing countries, but of course if you look across the United States of America, from Colorado to Washington State to Florida to California, we see huge and significant impacts. So how do we solve for both the debt crisis and the climate crisis together? That is the problem set in front of us, in particular this year. They are inextricably linked, and now we're seeing more and more initiatives coming forward that are, with some overlap, looking at this problem. The big question is the international financial system fit for purpose for this particular moment in history and this particular nexus of problems? Some of the proposals on the table would tweak the system that we have today. Some are calling for wholesale reform. Now, we're going to hear first from Minister Baerbock, who will give us her views, and then we will turn to the Managing Director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, and the President of the Bundesbank, Joachim Nagel. We were going to be joined also by Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, but she unfortunately at the very last minute decided that she couldn't be here, in part because there is unfortunately in Suriname a classic case of how these kinds of fuel price spikes can cause unrest, and I think she wanted, as one of the leaders of CARICOM, to stay in the region at this particular sensitive time for the people of Suriname. If she were here, she would frame for you the Bridgetown initiative, which she has given impetus to, named for Bridgetown, but which has galvanised and I think inspired people inside the international financial institutions, but also in governments around the world, civil society and philanthropy and the UN system. And really her 5-point agenda is, first, that we have to do something about the cost of capital to developing countries, ease the liquidity stress that so many of them find themselves in. And she has a number of ideas about how to do that, working very closely with the IMF and the tools and instruments available to them. Secondly, that we should really redefine what vulnerable means. It's not just income, but also what happens to countries that find themselves in the wrong geography and vulnerable to climate impacts, no matter what their income level is officially. And then thirdly, how do we galvanise the multilateral development bank system to free up $1 trillion a year to invest in the kinds of resilience that countries need and the kind of ability to invest in their own green growth? And then how to deal with loss and damage. This is the sort of compensation that needs to be found, or the funds for compensation, and she has a lot of very creative ideas about how we can do that, looking at oil companies, windfall profits, looking at taxation of business airline flights, as well as looking at other things that we can do. And then I think she would also point to the fact that we need to mobilise private investment at a level that we've never really been able to do on a sustained basis. So if she were here, she would be ferociously putting on the agenda a really quite substantial reform agenda which is gathering pace around the world. But I'm here just to frame and to get the best out of an extraordinary panel. And it's my pleasure to leave the floor now to the Foreign Minister. Ms. Baerbock, please.
Good afternoon also from my side. I will speak in German. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen,
Kristalina, Georgieva,
Madam Chair, Kristalina, Georgieva, Mr. Nagel, President of the Bundesbank, and I would have also welcomed Mia Mottley. It's really regrettable that she cannot be here this afternoon because she was one of the main initiators on this issue with the Bridgetown initiative, and she brought a lot of dynamic into this urgent yet difficult issue. While we are talking here, my country is underwater. My mother, my sister have lost their home, although my country has contributed almost nothing to this crisis. Hindu Umaro Ibrahim, an activist from Chad, told me that when I participated in a panel at the COP27 in the fall of last year, and with her urgent plea, she was right, because at that time we talked a lot about the floods in Pakistan, but the disaster in Chad basically remained under our radar. And similar to so many people around the world who day in, day out have to experience the impact of the climate crisis, she speaks on behalf of millions of people around the world. 3 times more people are now being displaced by the climate crisis than they are by wars. So the climate crisis is the biggest threat to security of our times. Hindu Umaro Ibrahim's words point out a blatant injustice, because the states that are suffering most from the climate crisis have contributed the least part to it. That's why at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh we discussed new ways of discussing compensation for losses and damages for the most vulnerable states. And as industrialized nations, we're consequently working on ambitious climate goals, particularly in the European Union. And yes, we do know that the reduction of CO2, the ambitious climate goals, do cost money. Experts estimate that the need for financing in developing and threshold countries is around $2.4 trillion annually to keep the 1.5 goal. But at the same time, we know, definitely since the Stern report, that every 10th of degree that we do not manage when it comes to increased temperature costs 2 or 3 times as much. And what we're also experiencing dramatically and have been experiencing over the past years, it costs lives, hundreds, thousands of human lives. And we see that with the climate crisis, another global crisis has become strengthened. 60% of the low-income countries have a high risk of indebtedness or are already in the middle of a debt crisis. The global inflation, increasing interest rates, and a strong dollar are basically an accelerant when it comes to this problem, and the Russian war has to be added to this as well. This dangerousness of this vicious circle of debt and climate crisis can be seen when we look at the island nation of Dominica. In 2017, when the terrible Hurricane Maria hit Dominica, it led to damages and losses amounting to 226% of the gross national product of Dominica. 226% of the country's GDP. So in order to repair these damages, Dominica had to incur new debt at higher interest rates, considerably higher interest rates than industrialized nations. So its indebtedness increased. Logically, a lot less money was left, hardly any money was left to prepare for the next hurricane. So this vicious circle will continue to exist. And this is a situation that is true for many countries around the world. They do not have enough money to adapt to the climate crisis. So whenever they're hit by the climate crisis, the damages will be even higher. But what they're also lacking is the money to establish an economic system with low emissions. They don't have the money to invest in the social realm, investments into education, health, etc. So what they're really missing is the air to breathe. We're here in a small group, but in many different international conferences, particularly also within the framework of the International Monetary Fund, we discuss how we can break this vicious circle together. And I want to mention two concrete aspects in the beginning. First, we jointly want to reform the World Bank so that its business model can be better focused on climate funding, the biggest threat to security, so also the biggest threat to our global economy. It will have to mobilize more private investments into climate and climate change, because if the World Bank advances, others, particularly development banks, can follow.
And at the same time, countries would have to be supported with extra funds for investing in green energy, etc. Developing countries, if we charge 4 times and if they have to pay 4 times as high in interest rates, then many green investments don't pay off anymore. And honestly speaking, it's not fair, no fair competition. Multilateral development banks can play an important role and make a contribution in order to protect investment risks and to reduce costs. And at the same time, and in order to be honest, we also have to say we should check ways that definitely will not be easy in order to reduce the debt of highly indebted nations. And what we are discussing here in the framework of the MSI climate crisis and the debt crisis, this influences the geopolitical situation, and the different interests of all actors are being shaped by that. Nevertheless, we must not close ourselves to this debate. And what is good about it is that there are already lots of good innovative ideas, and Mottley is one of the leaders in this respect. For example, a debt moratorium for countries hit by natural disasters, or debt for climate swaps, that is, if climate investments are necessary, that can be condoned. And also you will probably ask yourself, the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, what's her role here when talking about interest rates and investment risks? The reason is, since we are talking about an integrated security risk, when talking about the climate crisis, we are also talking about our security in the world, and we also talk about justice. And for me, for us as federal government, as we are planning an integrated security strategy, we cannot say, and this is climate protection, this is done by one ministry, and this is foreign policy in terms of geostrategy, and this is the Ministry of Finance. So this is the opposite of integrated security, and it also is the opposite of a networked world. And therefore, we are convinced if we want to handle this crisis effectively, then we have to do it holistically as a national government and also as an international community. Do we have to tackle it? What will be decisive is that international community does not only include state actors, but also private actors, so that private and public interests and private and public capital will have to be activated for climate-friendly investment. So we need politicians, financial sector, private companies, international financial institutions, and also a strong civil society, since this is what what is at the heart of it. Once we talk about that, then we also talk about the perspectives for the people in the respective regions and countries. And therefore, I'm very happy and look forward to the debate on that topic. It is about how highly indebted states we can give them air for breathing again, since only if you can breathe and if you do not permanently fear to suffocate, then can you prepare to be strong for the future, to be prepared for the next flood, not knowing when it'll come, the next hurricane, and also to protect yourself against every 1/10 of temperature increase and the greatest threat for all of us in this century. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground there. With insight and passion. So I think you've set up this conversation in a very thorough way. So first to you, Kristalina, if I may. Is the boldest climate action we could take to sort of write off debt? And of course, within that, there's all kinds of different ways that that you, the IMF, are looking at this, and together with all the members of the fund. But I think the point that the minister made, that Mia would make, is that to borrow, to get out of this vicious cycle that the minister referred to, I think Mia's made it clear that that's sort of morally reprehensible at this point in the 21st century, but also economically self-defeating for the world. So what tools do you already have, and what do you need from your members to be able to tackle this?
Great start of the discussion. The point that comes very clearly across is that this is a responsibility of everyone. We do face an existential threat, and it is no secret in this room or anywhere that we are way behind schedule to deal with this crisis. And taking from that, it is everybody's job. I want to first state what does it mean for us at the IMF. Our mandate is macroeconomic and financial stability, growth and employment. Climate risks already undermine macroeconomic and financial stability. And with the same token, many of the actions taken on the climate front for the green transition or for reducing vulnerability to climate risks, they generate growth and employment. Mm-hmm. So it is squarely for us within what we do to integrate climate. We went to our board of directors about 18 months ago, and we presented a strategy for the role of the fund. It was endorsed, and we are implementing it. It has 4 very important components. Number 1, when we discuss macroeconomic policies with countries, integrate mitigation, adaptation, transition. We already, for the G20 countries, already with 17 of them, we have done that or are in the process of doing it. And of course, we would put more emphasis on mitigation for large emitters, and we would put more emphasis on adaptation to highly vulnerable countries. Secondly, we have added a layer in our work on financial stability by including in our financial sector assessments climate risks. And we have worked with central banks on stress testing banks for these risks. 3, we have endorsed work on data, because if we don't have good data, we cannot make good decisions. And, Rachel, my ambition here is that when we put the summary of macro indicators, and we put there GDP per capita, inflation, unemployment, that we would also have carbon intensity and vulnerability to climate risks. We're not there yet, but this is the work we are taking. And finally, we are a financial institution. Countries look up to us to provide financing. We came up with a wonderful innovation, which is to counter the economic costs of COVID, we have provided our membership with a record high special drawing rights. This is our ability to lift up reserves of the membership. We created on the basis of the strength of 190 members. And Germany, of course, we are very grateful to you, very strong country, helps us to do so. But there is embedded unfairness because when we distribute special drawing rights, we don't do it on the basis of needs. We do it on the basis of quotas at the IMF. Wealthy countries have big quotas, poor countries have small quotas. So what we have said was, why don't we ask our better off members to please lend to us part of your SDRs, and we can then lend it to countries in need. And the way I describe it, because sometimes people say, what is this SDRs? They start rolling. It is this reserve assets we generate that for countries with big reserves turns into a dormant asset, like a sleeping beauty. So we invited the prince. It happened to be President Macron, the first one who made the commitment to on land. And we said, can you please kiss the sleeping beauty, wake it up? That happened. We also did something that is very relevant for the conversation. And by the way, we have $40 billion now. Germany cannot provide special drawing rights, but provide it equivalent of close to $6 billion, one of the first countries to make that dream of creating an instrument to help developing nations a reality. This is the moment when you guys do this. Bravo.
Thank you.
And I mean it, because it is so good to be able to help countries like Barbados, which is one of the first to benefit from our Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Today we have 4 countries that have already crossed the finish line: Barbados, Costa Rica, Rwanda in Africa, and Bangladesh. And the queue is actually very long. But the other innovation we did that is very relevant is something that me and Mottley has been advocating for decades. And it is to recognize that vulnerability to climate shocks should be considered criteria for access to concessional finance. Yeah. It used to be that you only apply income per capita. With that innovation, we are the first institution to provide concessional finance, 20 years maturity, 10 and a half years grace, on the basis of vulnerability to climate shocks. But I want to go to the question that you asked in the beginning. Shouldn't we wipe out debt? Isn't that the best thing we can do? And I would ask you to please don't go there. And I will tell you why. Because debt is not necessarily bad. We borrow to invest, and when we do the right thing, if we invest in renewable energy and sustainable agriculture, this debt is actually a very good thing to have. It is a problem when you borrow and then you invest in big white elephants and nothing comes out of, or even worse in some cases, steal the money. Obviously, we should be against that. Now, if countries, however, borrow, invest well, but are hit by exogenous shocks. You spoke about the hurricane. Yes, then there is merit in considering debt reduction, debt restructuring. And it is very important to do three things on this topic of debt and climate. Number one, go even further in introducing clauses in debt agreements that allow to stop debt service should a country suffer a shock, exogenous shock due to climate change. We already have some of these clauses, and the question is how we can go even further in making new debt, the one that is to come, more responsible to realities of a world with climate shocks. Number two, we have to recognize that climate and debt for many countries are two simultaneously hitting them challenges. And to build further debt for climate swaps as an instrument of choice. But if Mia was here, she would have said, we have done it in Barbados. It is a good instrument to bring down debt, buy back expensive debt, or just provide that debt reduction, and then use the space created in public finances for climate action, both mitigation and adaptation. At the IMF, we have a team that is now working on that, and their conclusion is that we have to go beyond the current menu, which is you free space, but you assign it to specific project activities. Expensive to monitor, not replicable. What we want is to go in a direction of programs with performance indicators, key performance indicators, and then the country gets the funding and the monitoring is simplified. And number three, to then think of where is the future for significant reduction of debt based on climate, linking it to climate. It is in the carbon offset market. Because if countries are able to put forward the carbon offsets they create to either sell them or use them to pay back their debt, that would be revolutionary in this conversation. I am convinced this will happen. Not immediately, because the carbon offset market is still not quite there. Yeah. But can you imagine 2030 when all those who made pledges to become carbon neutral by 2020, 2045, by 2050, they say, oops, we cannot do it on our own. The carbon offset market will come, and then we have to be ready to exploit it. So a lot to do, and the most important thing is we do it together.
So
thank you.
No, thank you. That was very. That was. All right. I'm just wondering one quick follow-up, and then I'm going to come to President of the Bundesbank, because in the last 7 years, central bankers have become the poster child and climate activists right around the world. So, which is something they probably didn't think was going to happen when they were studying as economists. But you talked about the SDRs and you talked about the RST, which is a real innovation for the fund, this Resilience and Sustainability Trust. The reflows haven't come as much as you want. You've got, what, about 50 billion? What would it take for you to be able to go to a few hundred billion? Because the need is there.
Proof of concept. Demonstrate that it works. we would go to our annual meetings. By the way, I should stress this because it is the staff of the IMF that has delivered remarkably well. We promised, the idea came in October 2021. In October 2022, we had an operational vehicle with $40 billion available, well, pledged, and some of it, half of it already available. And we got the first countries to move. This is, for anybody who knows our institutions, this is the speed of light. But now we have to show that actually that really contributes to faster adaptation to climate change and better mitigation policies in countries. So we have to, right now we are working with these 4 countries. Jamaica is the next to come. We have to go to the next annual meetings in October and say to everybody, hey, this is working. And I expect that, as President Macron has already said, he's going to go from 20% to 30%, because we deliver, that we would see many more stepping up. Our objective was to get to 100 billion on lending, both to the Resilience and Sustainability Trust and to our Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. We are at 83 billion in pledges. Some of these pledges have to go to domestic process of approval, and that may take a long time. But if we are to demonstrate that this works, I'm going to turn to everybody and say, why wouldn't you free more of your dormant asset for us to make it work? Why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I mean, what is the answer to this question? There is no, the only answer is, yeah, we are going to come and step up, I would think. Yes? I'm looking at my German friends here, they're nodding. Yes, Rachel, it has to be demonstrably not only improving policies, but serving as a magnet and barrier removal for more private finance to flow. And also, we have to demonstrate that we work with everybody else, because one of the problems today is not the lack of money, but that money is fragmented. And we at the IMF have a long history of aggregating finances in our programs. We have to make it work in this case as well.
So, President Nagel, you've been paid a compliment by the IMF, but if we look at the global situation, it's not just how the IMF can be utilised, it's also the multilateral development bank system, but it's also access to the bond markets. The cost of capital seems to be, in developing countries, is a real binding constraint on their ability to invest in their resilience and in their green growth. So what more can you do?
Can I have the rest of the 10 minutes? So first of all, it is an honor to sit here with these 3 remarkable ladies and to give a brief feedback to your question. I will speak in German, so you have time to put your headsets on. I think das ist, denke ich, eine ganz wichtige Frage.
I think this is an extremely important question for the countries that are suffering from a debt burden. It's got to do with bearability of a debt burden. And from the central bank's perspective, I have to say, when it comes to these topics, you have to give some orientation as to how capital markets work. And capital markets are strongly dependent on the interest rate environment and landscape. And from the viewpoint of the central bank, what I can say is we have a specific mandate that is to ensure price stability, that with inflation rates of 8% plus in Germany, 9%, that we have to do our job. We are an independent institution, meaning that interest rates, they have increased and they will continue to and have to increase to ensure price stability. These are periods of time time, and in the countries that are particularly hard hit will cause extra burden. But you have to be careful that it has to be a level playing field. We have to create that, and therefore we support the G20 initiatives, and that means the lenders and the debtors and the creditors, they have to agree on the terms and conditions, and we try to provide help also with the help of the IMF. But central banks, we are not development banks. That has to be clear. And please, I need to warn you also, since this would cover topics that would hinder us in our actual mandate and will influence us in the incorrect way. And what is very important in this consideration, we also have to make sure, and I mean, it's a huge task, and therefore the private lenders, we must not push them to the sidelines, since when it comes to the financing terms and conditions, if we are too attractive, then the private creditors will be pushed out of the market. And the climate change topics, only in Europe, here in Europe, about 500 billion euros per year will have to be mobilized every single year, 500 billion. And this will not work with public money only. So it has to be clear, private money has to be mobilized. There are new interesting ways of financing, blended finance, so a combination of public and private funds, and also what Kristalina does on the part of the IMF, the excellent funds, the trusteeship funds or the trust, they make a contribution, but we have to find a mix between public and private finance and funds. And us, the central banks, I would not say we are climate activists, but we definitely have realized how important the climate topics are also for a good monetary policy. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs said, why am I sitting here as central banker, even though it's about the climate, since us, the topics that we focus on as central banks, stable prices, stable financial markets, I mean, only if we have that, climate financing can be done, above all in the weakest and most vulnerable countries of our planet.
So let me just follow up with you directly, and then I'll ask the Minister to reflect on what she's heard, because 2023 is the year when we have to take the technical banking capability, the incredible resources within the international system, and we've got to turn a lot of these pledges into action. So it was Kristalina's predecessor, Christine Lagarde, who first talked about climate as a macroprudential risk. And it was in the years just after the Paris Agreement when we started to see central banks talking about stress testing, and we started to see central banks looking at how to look at their own financial sector. We now see these Article 4 reviews where the IMF goes in and does a health check on a country, and also a health check on its banking system through the FSAPs. So in the G20 finance ministers, and where the central bank governors are all meeting together, when we look at the global financial system, and we know we need to leverage more private investment into the green future that we all need, is that a global conversation now, or is that sort of the EU doing its own thing, waiting for the United States to sort of catch up a little bit? China's doing its own thing. How does, if you're a developing country and you're needing to access the bond markets at a reasonable price, do you think it's going fast enough, or is this, or not? Mr. Nagel.
Also ich würde zunächst mal bei dem Thema,
when it comes to this issue, I would say we're never satisfied with the speed. That's self-evident. And some interest rates that states pay that they cannot really pay give the impression that these are states that are being pushed out of the market. From the vantage point of a central bank, the most important thing in cooperation with the IMF is to ensure that there is a stable financial system. There's one thing that we can't forget and shouldn't forget. We are going through a plethora of perfect storms. We had the pandemic. We are being drawn into this terrible attack war of Russia, and then we have the global issues like climate change and everything related to that, the additional funds that need to be made available for that. And taken individually, these issues are bad enough. So it is important to ensure that there is a stable financial system. And let me also remind you, we went through a phase where the interest rates were extremely low. And we, as a central bank, have always pointed out that this is something that the creditors should not keep up into the future, and this has happened now. We came back to a level of interest rates that we were familiar with 10 or 12 years ago, regular, normal interest rates, and that's necessary not just because of stable prices, but interests are always, to a certain extent, risk indicators. The way certain financial instruments work is something that we cannot completely leave aside. So there need to be different levers, public money, public funds. There needs to be a basic level crowd money, and then the rest that might have to go through credits, through loans. But it needs to be clear for all countries that there need to be predetermined paths towards debt reduction. And that very often is an issue that is moving more and more into the background when you look at the bearability of countries to deal with their debts.
Thank you very much. So, Minister, 2023, we need some political action building on all of this, the crisis, but also the fact that there are so many different ideas about how to tackle the crisis. That's the good news. What does it look like from your standpoint? How can you lead? Who do you need with you to turn this from words to action?
Ja, so wie bereits ausgeführt wurde, die unterschiedlichen
as it has already been said, I can only subscribe to what Mr. Nagel said. It's not that there's one institution and one element that can be used to deal with all of these challenges. Maybe I can make it a little bit more complex. If you look at what the European Union is doing or did with a view to our euro crisis, and it was exactly this issue of sovereign debt crisis, one of the elements was that we are a political union that jointly agreed on the Maastricht criteria, other criteria, plus certain standards, and we jointly as a political union passed common laws. And in this context, it was already very difficult. The Europeans in this room might remember it was very difficult to ensure that, with a view to the question of transferability of debts and the question of interest rates, it was very hard to find solutions, not just because it was politically challenging, but also because we have very tight constitutional law restrictions. We had a lot of complaints brought before our constitutional court, and that's why one of the proposals that is being discussed by us when it comes to second-hand lending, there are certain problems and certain limitations under German legislation when it comes to passing on, transferring special drawing rights, and that's why we made a proposal how budgetary means we could, from the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, we would make certain means available. 6 billion, you thankfully already mentioned that, we would be making that available to become active within the framework of that trust. And it's important to recognize that it's not a panacea, a one-size-fits-all tool, but on the other hand, it's also not possible that everybody leans back and says, not possible, we don't do it, we can't do it. So we have to create a mosaic, and that's what we agreed at the COP, how different elements can be brought together. Nonetheless, with a view to the special drawing rights for individual countries, and I think that's what you also mentioned during the COVID pandemic, we have seen that this is something that we should keep up. And I think there's a lot of harmony here, but I'd like to nonetheless mention the elephant in the room, namely to debt relief and debt transfer. I recently visited Ethiopia, where we looked at financing possibilities and closely connect this to the food crisis, which is also closely connected to the climate crisis, and where when you have a democracy and every 4 or 5 years you have to be re-elected, it's not that easy to say we will completely provide debt relief for one country, because it's probably not the country that will benefit from it and they will be able to make the next investment into climate mitigation. But this is a debt relief where the former creditor is achieving a certain level of debt relief. That's why it's important that every industrialized nation like Germany looks at what we can do individually, but we need all of the players, and one of the biggest creditors globally is China. China has to be on board if we want to make additional steps together. And the last aspect that I would like to just briefly take up, private investors. The Federal Central Bank is having difficulty in admitting that they're climate activists. As a green politician, I am sometimes surprised to see the path that we've embarked upon, but that's just the way it is. In a changing world, we, from the side of the German government, me as a green foreign minister, when we say we cannot do it alone with public investments, the tasks are way too big for that. And that's why we have made a lot of proposals in Germany as well that need to be transferred to the international level as well. We need kickoff financing, public kickoff financing, private stakeholders who come in, and we need to also have a debate. If things become profitable, and not with loss and damages, but in other areas we have a certain profitability element. And in Germany, through carbon contracts for differences, we discuss how public money, once invested, how can that be paid back when profits are generated. And I think this new thinking, this rethinking of cooperation between public and private hand enables us to open up ways that we didn't have in the past.
Well, two huge crises, climate and debt, driving insecurity worldwide, and so we could have talked for another hour, clearly. But I think what we need to take away from this is the publics of the developed world have to understand how inextricably linked we all are to each other. And we have to find some way of taking the system that we have with all of the ingenuity, all of the capital that's already in it, and make it work for everybody. And if we can make it work for those who are the most vulnerable, we will all benefit. And so we have central bankers, we have the IMF, we have green foreign ministers. Everybody, it's going to take everybody, and we're going to have to find new ways of working. Huge responsibility for the Indian G20, huge responsibility for the Japanese G7, for Brazil at the G20 next year. Thank you for your leadership. Let's turn words into action, pledges into concrete plans. But thank you. Please thank the panel.